These are pretty new, and it's not easy to implement them. So I'm sure that's why a lot of people are here. And then we'll spend like 10 minutes or more on a question period, depending on the interest. So let's start with the GDPR. So the GDPR was published in 2016. It's already been quite a few years now, and we've gone through quite a few gates as it's been deployed and implemented out into the industry. When I implement frameworks, I create this little matrix for each of them and look at the control areas within each of the different principles. There's 99 articles within 11 chapters, and there's a number of different control objectives, if you like, if you're from the COBIT world, that are defined within each of these areas that need to be addressed. So, and it's pretty massive actually when you think about it, but it's a little, it's very detailed, and it can be implemented. It's just not that, it's not too complex, I don't think, but it is quite detailed. I went through the standard and created sort of a breakdown based on my experience on where I see the work allocation would be from implementing a GDPR in an organization. Starting out with architecture, I think we hear a lot of talk about privacy by design or by default. What that really equates to is having some kind of cybersecurity architecture. So rather than fumbling around trying to fit the legislation into the organization, probably the simplest thing to do is to spend some time and do some architectural work around where private information is handling around the infrastructure. 2% spent on auditing. Often, sadly, in a lot of modern frameworks, auditing is often neglected. And I know there's a lot of auditors on this call, so you feel my pain. The only standard that I've ever seen actually auditing baked into was COBIT and ISO 27001. And all the other frameworks don't seem to have any auditing in them. So it's unfortunate. We have to create this as we go forward. 2% of the time is based on auditing, 2% on protocol, developing some kind of an immediate response to any type of breach. I've worked on many breaches, and there is a detailed plan. It's a lot like a playbook that needs to be created. You need to have speaking points, short speaking points and long speaking points to prep the president and the CEO on what to say. And then, of course, you need to have a very good incident handling process that can capture and record any type of forensic evidence that might help you to resolve the reason why the breach happened. So, but the breach protocol is a very high level type of a policy document that helps to set the stage with senior management on what needs to happen. Business planning is an important part of any process. And the GDPR doesn't really talk about business planning, but there is a part of it that I've identified that you need to do. So after the implementation, you need to have some kind of a plan to move forward with over the next few years in order to implement it and to continually improve it and get it up to the point where it's fully matured. Data classification is very important. Although GDPR only talks about private information, there's lots of different types of information in an organization. And my experience has been, if you want to implement GDPR properly, you really need to take an assessment of all the different types of assets that you have within the organization, because you just can't come out with one classification, private information. You need to have confidential information. You probably need to have a classification for public. And I'm going to talk about that too a little bit later on in the presentation. Just doing a checkpoint here. So am I speaking too fast? Can you understand what I'm saying? Is it coming across?
I suppose it sounds great.
Okay. So go ahead, you understand, everything's good? Okay, I'll continue. If you do find that I'm speaking fast, maybe you can just send us a message in the chat and we can address it then, okay? Define terms. I think this is important, especially when dealing with lawyers. It's good to have defined terminology. I think in cybersecurity, we should practice this a little bit more as well. Understanding what it is by a term, when you say that term, it's very important so everybody's on the same page to begin with, because there are many different understandings. In our case, it's not just about languages. Different languages have different meanings for different words, but also within each of our languages, there's different meanings of the same term. So, and English is a very complicated language, which often has multiple 2 or 3 definitions for a term. So it's good to define the terms around privacy so everybody understands. I see a whopping 35% of the articles, 99 articles that refer to activities that involve governance. So governance is a big part of GDPR, managing authorities and who has decision-making power around the handling of personal information to provide the guidance requires quite a bit of effort. And it doesn't mean that you have a governance committee that spends 35% of their time working on GDPR. What it means is that of all the articles, 37% of all the articles touch on some aspect of governance. And so you need to have a pretty good governance framework from a governance committee right down through into the organization and around the decisions, roles and responsibilities. If you have a RACI chart, that will probably help explain things. Human resources has a role to play as well in the GDPR, approximately 3%. 1% is around information handling, some kind of information handling procedure. I have a very smooth, sophisticated kind of approach that I've developed with organizations to make a lot of this very seamless and make it much easier to manage. I'm going to talk about. The actual percentage that lawyers are actually involved that I see is only about 6% of the 99 articles. So lawyers are necessary for sure. Defining agreements, schedules, flow down clauses, working to resolve any kinds of issues if there is a breach. Those are the main focal areas. But the actual operationalization of GDPR has very little to do with lawyers. In fact, I would say it has nothing to do with them. Risk management, 5%. I think this is something, again, that gets neglected. I noticed a lot of people working on GDPR. There's 2 key documents really that need to be done up front. And I'll talk about those on the 4 steps. And that's doing a privacy impact assessment and doing a risk assessment to make sure that you have the controls in place that would be defined by the security architecture, for instance. Policy, there's definitely a need for policy. As you know, there's privacy policies that need to be made. There's policies to consenting to gather information. There's policies around the right to be forgotten that needs to be issued. There's policies around the different types of personal information. So policy is important. Procedures make up another big chunk of the process. So there is going to have to be some new procedures around, the handling to make sure that we comply with the 6 principles of the GDPR. So making sure that we're collecting just enough to do whatever the activity is that needs to be done, making sure that we have a process on how to deal with the people who want to be forgotten. Also a process how to deal with any inquiries or updates to their personal information. And of course, on the front end, procedures on how to record consent. Consent. Pardon me. Gathering, pardon me. Gathering consent. I still don't have my voice back. Excuse me. Gathering consent is really important, and sometimes it's thought of after the fact, unfortunately. But when you go through the process of gathering people's personal information from an application or a website or from a third party, you need to be able to record the consent, because I've seen instances where people have made inquiries to the organization and said, you know, why do you collect my information? I didn't give you permission for that. So the organization has had to, you know, be able to prove that they had consent. And sometimes when the organization goes back to look to see if they've recorded, you know, that one click when somebody's clicked on the terms of agreement and captured that information and enough information to be able to say that it was that person who provided the consent. Those are the types of details, little details that need to be, you know, documented within that procedure in order to make sure that we have that evidence. Standards need to be set. Again, so this also feeds into the security architecture. So what are the types of standards around where we collect information, how we protect information, the types of different encryption, where that information can flow? Those kinds of questions come up in that process. So we have to have standards and we have to have some kind of a scope. So understanding, and this really applies to the reason why you're collecting the information. So if you're collecting the information, it's for a specific business purpose, you need to make sure that that scope is maintained. A lot of times organizations will gather the information and then all of a sudden someone will come up with an idea to use it for another purpose. And we don't have consent for that secondary purpose. So it's possible that we could get ourselves into trouble by using the information for other purposes that have not been consented to. In fact, we might have to go out and request permission from those people again in order to use it. And of course, you could make your policy rather vague so that you could collect the information and use it for almost anything. I've seen that done before. And in Canada, we have a privacy commissioner, a federal privacy commissioner. And I've reviewed over 400 investigations by the privacy commissioner. And there are many, many more. There are probably over 1,000 now investigations. And, you know, over collecting information and using a privacy policy that's too vague is also, they've been findings against organizations. So you have to be rather specific about why you're collecting it and using it. Okay, so that's kind of my high-level analysis of the 99 articles within the 11 chapters of GDPR. And you can see just by looking at this, again, the legal implication here. I know a lot of organizations are putting lawyers in charge of their GDPR compliance, but my opinion is that that's a mistake. I've seen privacy compliance programs in the healthcare system, for instance. I work with health authorities, and it's like, I don't know if in Turkish if you have an expression like this, but it's like having the tail wag the dog instead of the dog wagging the tail. And I know there's lots of cats and dogs running around in Turkey, so you probably know exactly what I'm talking about. But this is not a 100% legal issue. It's very small, actually. And in order to operationalize something, you really need to have a better handle on the operations. And so just saying. All right. So as I said before, this is mostly an impact on operations and not necessarily on the legal aspect. Now, I like to create this information handler's circle of trust because when I teach people about information handling, I try to go through all the different scenarios that could possibly happen where you make a decision about handling private information or any other type of information for that matter. So when we require information, we have a governance process in place to protect that information and how it's managed. As I mentioned before, 35% of the process is governance. And then we also have an information risk aspect to this. So what is the risk by mishandling information or handling information, or where do we store it? How do we protect it? Those types of questions need to be asked. So we begin by acquiring information. We might acquire it through a website. We may actually create instances of personal information by combining data from different sources. We need to make decisions about the security of the information. We need to make decisions about who we can share the information with. We need to make decisions about how to audit that information, how to add records, use records, or change records. We also need to make decisions around where we can archive it, if it's possible to archive some information. In some cases, if you look at the PCI DSS standard, for instance, you'll know that card numbers are only supposed to be kept for the transaction. And once the transaction is completed, the card number is supposed to be erased, gone. So some types of personal information are definitely time-bound and transitory, as we like to say. So it's in motion, it's used, and then it's gone. How do we interface personal information with other systems? Do we have the authorization to disclose information? Are there any exclusions, such as in the Canadian privacy legislation? There are exclusions. So one is for law enforcement investigations, and the other is for credit bureau or credit inquiries. So if people are looking for collections of outstanding delinquent bills, there's an exclusion. Consolidating, how do we consolidate? Can we consolidate information? If we have a consent, what are we allowed to do with the consolidation? Are we allowed to migrate it from one system to another? Maybe we have consent to collect it in one particular location and we're not allowed to migrate it. Can we recycle it? Can we reuse it? Usually the answer is no, because we collect it for one purpose, so we can't recycle it and use it for different purposes. How do we go about deleting that information? Or how do we go about disposing of that information permanently? So when it's time to get rid of the information, what's the safest way to get rid of it? And I know my experience has been a metal chipper. That's, most people say, put it on the drive. Forensic investigators have been able to recover up to 7 overwrites of data. So it's wiser to probably metal chip the data on the drive. Now we need to be cautious. There's a couple things here I've noticed in my career. There are external suppliers involved sometimes with the handling of personal information, maybe the processing or the collection of information. So we need to make sure that we have flow down clauses. And some of you might be familiar with these, but if you're not, I'll explain quickly. A flow down clause allows you to take the law and write it into a contractual agreement. And what does that give you? What leverage does that give you? It gives you a lot, actually. Because what it allows you to do is say, okay, as most of you know, wherever the data rests, that's the law that applies. So if you have your data resting in Turkey, then the Turkish law applies. If it's resting in the UK, then the UK law applies. But if you use flow down clauses with these organizations, the flow down clauses include, for instance, the GDPR principles and the type of security that has to go in around them. Then wherever that contract is enforced, it's international. So those rules, those security standards, the requirements for the privacy plan are also enforced as part of the contract. And then all of a sudden, the data law that is based on the country doesn't become as important anymore, right? So flow down clauses are important to include. And also the other angle with flow down clauses is that sometimes you have a third party working on your information and they're providing some kind of a processing function maybe, or storage, but they might hire a third party to provide some of the service. And that happens a lot, actually. You'd be surprised how many partners have third parties working on data. The flow down clause requires the primary organization to include the schedule or the article of flow downs with any of their subcontractors. So in fact, it flows down from one agreement to another agreement to another agreement until everywhere that personal information is touched, it's enforced by the same requirements. So flow downs are very vital. Interested parties. So there's lots of interested parties that want to know about your personal information. I mentioned a couple. So there are people who do collections, and there's law enforcement. So they will make inquiries, and some organizations, I think like Facebook and a few of the big tech companies have, pushed back on law enforcement inquiries for information, because obviously it would jeopardize the credibility of their organization. But at the same time, there's a sort of a fine line. So you have to, figure out, what you can do, what you can't do based on the law. Maybe you have no choice. In the US, they have the Patriot Act. So if you're an American and you have access to personal information and the government wants to see what it is, they can demand you give it to them or put you in jail, right? So if those are your choices, you might give it to them and risk the chance of being busted for breaching any sort of contractual obligations. So organizations should refrain from using unlawful information sharing agreements are another aspect as well. So between government ministries, before privacy legislation was invoked, they have agreements between the different ministries to share different types of information. So you may have motor vehicle ministry who handles cars and licensing and all that sort of stuff, sharing information with maybe the Ministry of Finance or maybe the Ministry of Revenue. They share private information. And these are all secondary purposes, because the reason why they collected that information was to provide a service to the citizens. But now all of a sudden they're sharing it with other people. And of course, you're not aware of this. But I'm telling you, information sharing agreements are something that should be reviewed and considered. And other clandestine techniques to gather personally identifiable information. Okay. So the 4 steps that I mentioned that are quite popular, actually, thousands of people are looking at these 4 steps saying, wow, this is pretty slick. This is actually a very, very concise approach to implementing GDPR compliance. So the first step is a robot similar to what we use in PCI to look for any kind of card data that might be stored on different systems or in the cloud. So they'll release a robot, a software robot, into the system, and it's like a web crawler, but it's focused on the internal side of the infrastructure, and it will crawl across all your systems and devices, and it will look for the different instances that it finds of personal information, and then it will report those back to the person who released it. So it might take time, but that's one way of finding different instances. You also need to do some kind of a data flow packet analysis. And the reason why you need to do that is because your data, personal data, when they enter it in the website, will come through the web into your infrastructure, but it's going to hop across different devices before it gets to its resting place. It might go through, well, it's going to go through the firewall, maybe 2 firewalls probably. It might go through routers, switches. There may be some taps involved if you have intrusion prevention system. There could be load balancers. There could be a number of different types of devices where that data might be decrypted. It might be visible. And it's possible for someone maybe to capture a glimpse or some data, especially if you have mirroring or any sort of split traffic for IPS. There's going to be duplicate records captured. So you need to do, some packet flow analysis to make sure that you've looked at all the infrastructure that touches the personal information packets and make sure that the security standards are developed for those systems. Identifying the risks of potential breaches. So this goes hand in hand with this process. As you identify the packet flow, you'll identify the devices. Then you need to do some kind of a risk assessment to make sure that the devices have been hardened and that there's some security around those devices. And a key part of proving that privacy impact assessment demonstrates that you're compliant with GDPR is important to have some kind of a risk assessment to show that there's protection around that information. Now, PIA, unlike other documents that we do that are more based on one snapshot of the environment, a PIA is actually a living document. So if you have a data protection officer or a chief cybersecurity officer or a CISO, they might be responsible for creating a registry of the personal information instances in your organization. And they should be writing a PIA for each of those instances in case they're ever asked by the GDPR Council, what instances do you have and why do you have them? Because the privacy impact assessment would clearly tell them why they have it, why they're collecting it, and how it complies with the GDPR. So you could easily shut down any kind of a discussion that could escalate into maybe an investigation if you have up-to-date PIAs for every instance that you collect data. Step 2, operationalizing compliance. This is another very important aspect. We need to have a classification schema, and I'm going to show you an example of one in a minute. Classification schema essentially says here's all the different types of information we handle. Private information is one type, and here's an example of it, and here's how we protect that information. So it's kind of like a policy, but it's more of a standard. B2B, create security standards that match the private data handling lifecycle. And I'll show you an example of that. It's abridged because I couldn't obviously include everything in the slide deck. And C, create a private data information handling procedure. So this is a really slick way. I'm going to show you a workflow for that. This is a very slick way to basically address compliance with GDPR with all your employees. So yes, we'll have to do communications, and yes, we have to do awareness training, but what are you going to teach them? And my recommendation is that you create an information handling procedure, and you teach them about how to identify different types of information and what security controls are applied to those. And if you can teach your employees to do that, then you basically addressed the GDPR issues or any potential risks around them. And then of course, D, creating flow down clauses. So, taking a look at your vendors and service providers, and if they handle personal information or touch it, or touch the systems that handle it, making sure that, they're following the rules and that they're not doing anything that's going to create a breach. Step 3, develop data protection skills and resources. So again, as I mentioned before, delivering awareness training, bringing people's skills up to the level where they actually know what personal information is and they know how to handle it. Very important. And it's not just the regular employees, it's the contractors and service providers. Anybody that comes into contact with that personal information needs to attend training. There needs to be records kept of attendance. And of course, if there's a way to evaluate those employees and their understanding of compliance requirements around GDPR, then that should be recorded as well. Number 4, verify and validate, provide assurance to executive board of directors. This is, the auditors or a third party's role, right, is to make sure that whatever the process is that you've defined and that you follow, that it can be verified and validated and checked on. And it's a very important step in the process. I think a lot of these frameworks around any type of information protection are so vital and so important, but the audit aspect of it is almost totally neglected, and where auditors are kind of left on their own to figure out what it is that we need to do when it comes to, checking compliance for these. So I'm going to go over the key controls in a minute, and those are some areas I think that auditors should be looking at. I mentioned a workflow. So if you have an information handling practice, and this is what you teach employees, an employee will get a request for personal information, or they'll be handling information, and they'll need to somehow verify any sort of access to that information. So if somebody requests access to personal information, you should be validating whether or not, or that person should be validating whether or not the person making the request has the authority to access it. So you need to verify entitlements by checking perhaps with their direct report or their direct manager. Also, they might check with the designated data protection officer to see what they know about who has access to different types of information. I think this is something that DPO should know. They may even have an authorization list, or there may be a role-based access control defined where they know what groups within the organization have access to those different types of private information within your organization. Then, of course, labeling information. This could be done automatically within a number of automated systems such as webmail or email. Outlook provides this. Office 365 provides labeling. Also, if you're manually, copying information to a thumb drive or sharing it with somebody in some kind of fashion, it needs to be labeled properly. The authorization classification schema is important to the labeling process so that you know how to label that information. Again, not all information is private. Some of it is confidential, some of it might be public, some of it might be even restricted. And it's the chief cybersecurity officer, the chief information officer, or maybe even the DPO should be the people who are looking at the schema and helping to define that policy and making sure that information is part of the training exercise. And of course, verifying information classification, again, with the DPO is important. Applying the security standards. So who helps set the security standards? The chief cybersecurity officer, the chief information officer. The DPO might have some input on it if a risk assessment's been done against the different devices, appliances, servers, databases, and a set of controls have been recommended or implemented. Then they may also get involved in that process. And then finally, the authorization is either granted or it's denied. And of course, we need to maintain records. So this is an important part of every exercise. Auditors, we all preach this to people all the time. Sometimes they don't listen to us, but keeping records are so important. And as I tell the people that I work with, without the records, we have no evidence of proving that you ever did the right thing. So it's very important to keep those records so that we can prove it. Now, in the next few slides, I'm going to show you some examples of a classification schema. Security architecture will be near the end of the presentation, but I will show you some security standards, for instance, for around personal information. And I'm not going to talk too much about the document hierarchy or the document tree today, but when you provide access and you record information, obviously down here, there's a record kept at every stage. So whether a process is executed, whether standards are used, there's always going to be some kind of evidence or should be evidence of that process being carried out. And finally, these are the 4 steps that we just reviewed. Okay, so what does a schema look like? Well, it might look like this. Here's an example if you haven't done one before. So we have public, confidential, private, and restricted. Public information, of course, is information that's being released to the public. A number of examples of that: marketing material, shareholder reports after they've been approved by the board might be released, any sort of news articles or industry reporting. Types of confidential information include any type of policies that don't include security standards. Any type of contracts or customer lists or budgets are probably kept confidential, so they're not to be shared with the public. Private information, of course, includes employee information, so important, customer private information, any type of correspondence. And there's a long list actually of types of information that could be considered private. So this is just an example, a short list. And then there may be restricted. And the restricted type of information is the stuff that our president and our chief executive officer and the executive team or the board of directors might be working on. This is sensitive. If you're in the commercial sector, not so much the government maybe. We have strategic 5-year plans, 3 to 5 year plans. We have goals. Maybe it's on market capitalization. It could be on growth. It could be mergers and acquisitions. This is the type of information that's not private. It's more than just confidential, and it's definitely not public. But this type of information needs to be protected at a higher standard, in my opinion. And I'm going to give you some examples of some types of security standards next. So to map the classification schema, we have security standards. And these are some very simple ways that you can document this information and share it so that you can communicate it effectively. So we have the classification schema, public, confidential, private, and restricted. And then over on the left-hand side, we have the different types of information handling. And I have an Excel spreadsheet that I used to develop this in. I'm only going to show you like the top 6 or 7 here. But there's a long list. So if you remember on the circle of trust, there was a whole bunch of decision points, right? Around acquisition of information sharing, maintenance, disposing. There's a whole bunch of decisions that need to be made around it. But then during the operational phase, there's also a number of decisions that need to be made. So for instance, granting access. So granting access generally doesn't change across any of the different classifications. So whether it's public, confidential, private, or restricted, it's always the designated owner, custodian, or maybe the data protection officer that makes that decision. Human authentication versus machine authentication. So under public, of course, there's no restriction. But these are examples. So these are all the same here for confidential, private, and restricted. So you may implement all of these, or you may only implement one or maybe none. But these are just some examples of if you wanted to, authenticate humans, what do you need? So you need an identity and access management system. You need access control. You're going to use two-factor authentication or maybe RSA tokens or public key infrastructure if you want to encrypt it across your infrastructure and not allow people to see it. And you might have some requirements around password construction or user account construction for that matter. And you may also use biometrics. So you may have a higher level of control here required under restricted. It may include biometrics. Transmission over the internet. Again, public has no restriction. Confidential, you're going to use the normal TLS, SSL, and maybe Tor. You could include those under private plus VPN or WPA2, and of course under restricted because of the sensitivity of the information. Now we don't want it leaking out in any way, so we're going to keep it off the internet, and it's just going to be shared in the boardroom with the various managers, senior managers. Storage on servers under public, there's no restriction, but under confidential, we may be using AES 256, or we might be using RAID 5 so that we can reconstruct any kind of corrupted data and protect the integrity of that data. Under private, we may have used some of the built-in features of Microsoft or of other chip manufacturers, and also some of the ERP systems, also SAP HANA, I've had the pleasure to work with, has some really good security. They're getting down to the chip level and processing level as well. So a lot of these types of technologies protect data all the way from rest, all the way during processing, and all the way back again. So it can't be eavesdropped or intercepted. And under restricted is basically the same for storage on servers. Storage on removable disk or media, I mean. No restriction under public, under confidential. We may use AES 256 or public key infrastructure, and it's not authorized under private. So private information and restricted information should not be copied to removable media. That's probably going to turn out to be a bad thing if you do, because if it gets lost, you're going to have some explaining to do. Transmission over email, no restriction for public, but confidential information might use end-to-end encryption, two-factor authentication, A+ SSL certificates, DLP or DANE. And again, private and restricted information should not be passed over email, although it probably is. It shouldn't be, because email is extremely vulnerable to being hacked. And then finally, disposal. And again, this is an abridged list of standards. The list that I normally use is about 38 or 40 different control points around different decisions around information handling. There's no restriction under public, because we want public information to be shared. So we're not going to restrict it. It doesn't need to be disposed of. We're hoping it doesn't get disposed of. We're hoping people read it and see it. Under confidential information, private and restricted, I've added all the three different types of controls that are most popular. So cross-cut shredding, of course, overriding 7 times, and of course using a metal shredder if it involves a hard drive or something that has information on it. So these two things work together: the classification schema and the security standards here, with the information handling practice, to really operationalize the control of personal information. Now, some of the key control areas, I definitely recommend that you have an information protection management system. So I think if you want to create any kind of sustainable process, you need to include some kind of a management system. And I'm going to explain the management system, but here's some of the different issues, areas that I mentioned in my analysis of the GDPR around that pie chart. So, the architecture, auditing, breach protocol, business plan, data classification, defining terms of reference, governance, human resources, information handling, legal aspects of GDPR, risk management policies, procedure standards, and scope are all things that need to be handled through some kind of a management process. And could you handle them ad hoc? Perhaps. Would it be successful? Probably not. If you follow that maturity curve, you need to have some kind of a documented process, and you need somebody to provide oversight for that process to make sure that it happens. Privacy impact assessment really needs to demonstrate compliance with the principles of personal information. Now, if you've done privacy impact assessments before, usually they have an opening. They say, here's the type of information we're collecting, and here's what we're going to be using that information for. And then if you check the box that says that, yes, we do collect personal information, then there's going to be more questions. How do you collect it lawfully? It's one of the questions. How is it fair? How is it transparent? You need to be able to provide an explanation. It doesn't have to be lengthy, it can be brief, but the PIA is supposed to be a living document to show how you comply. So you need to explain how you comply with the lawful collection of personal information. What is the purpose? The limitation. So the purpose really helps to set the boundaries on what it's going to be used for, and ensuring that it's a limited collection. And that's also step 3, data minimization. So making sure that you're not over collecting. A long time ago, before there were really privacy laws, a lot of times companies would send out, forms if you wanted to get credit, or if you wanted to, get health insurance or something, and they would collect a lot of over information that not necessary to provide a decision. And that's really what it gets down to from the organization side. How much information do I really need to make a decision, right? And anything above what you need to make that decision is over collection. So that's something you have to look at in order to comply with data minimization. Accuracy, making sure that the information is accurate. And this, of course, falls back to where we have a process or a procedure where if somebody has personal information and they've submitted it to us and they're using our services because of that, and there's a change, maybe they're moving, maybe there's more of them, maybe they're having, maybe they have children now or something, and it changes the accuracy of the information. You need to somehow be able to provide a process for them to be able to update that. And the privacy impact assessment needs to define what is that process? How do you do that? And then, of course, there's the storage limitation. And there'll be many inquiries into storage limitation. And this is something where the risk assessment comes in handy because when you need to prove that you're protecting the personal information, you need to have the risk assessment and you need to have the cybersecurity architecture in order to explain where the personal information is and how it's being protected. And then, of course, there's integrity and confidentiality, maintaining that. And this also blends into, you know, the process of handling the information, make sure that it's accurate and making sure that it's been secured in some way by using probably technology. Data packet flow analysis. I don't see how you can get around not doing data flow analysis. You're going to have to find out where the data hops are, because if you can't, then you don't know what devices have access to that personal information and what people behind those devices. So you'll need to look into that, find out where the data hops are. You need to do the risk assessment again, as I mentioned before, to prove that you have protection in place. And if you don't and you have gaps, then you need a way to talk to management and prioritize the mitigation of any kind of open risks or exposures to any type of breaches. You need to enforce a classification schema and those accompanying standards that I showed you. And you need to have some kind of information handling procedure to teach people. And again, you need cybersecurity architecture. And it's often referred to as privacy by design or privacy by default, not architecture. That's a typo there, sorry about that. But they're really asking for architecture. And I'm going to show you an example of that too, shortly. Okay, so I know we spent some time on going through GDPR, and now we're about to jump into NIST. So how's it going so far?
That's great for me. Before you begin NIST cybersecurity framework, I have a question. You explained about GDPR implementation. We generally use cybersecurity framework of NIST to understand the cybersecurity resilience of an entity. But how does it fit with GDPR necessities? I mean, do they fit completely, or are there gaps between them?
I remember, so I've been following NIST since like President Obama issued, Presidential Directive 21. And I remember in that framework, there was lots of talk about privacy. And then all of a sudden, there was some follow-up meetings before it was published. And I think the FBI was invited in, and maybe the NSA into the discussion. And then all of a sudden, everything that said the word privacy was gone. It's kind of funny. But then, of course, in 1.1, it came back again a little bit. So the question is, how do they fit together? Personally, I've always been a big ISO 27001 fan. I think ISO 27001 is it's more suited for commercial enterprise. The NIST framework, it even says right in the opening paragraphs of the standards, it's developed by the e-commerce group for US government, right? And when I see and when I help commercial enterprises try to adopt the NIST cybersecurity framework, I always warn them up front. I say, it's kind of like PCI, because if you're involved in PCI, you know that PCI, once you say that you're going to do PCI compliance, they try to get you to go to, the maturity level 4 or 5 within like a year or 2. It's very aggressive. approach. And that's kind of the way NIST cybersecurity framework is. It's very aggressive. And now there are even organizations, I'm not sure about in Turkey, but in Canada, the federal government is actually issuing licenses now to organizations so that they can go in and certify companies. So they're kind of following the ISO framework, where you implement the framework and then you have some accreditation body come in and actually validate that it's in place and working. So they are trying to implement it in commercial sector. I don't think it's a very good fit. I don't see, when I talk about the NIST cybersecurity framework, you'll see, I don't think it has anything to do much with privacy, but yeah, but I'm glad that you guys are doing it. So maybe I should come to your presentation next and see how you're doing it. All right.
Thank you, Mark.
Yes.
Thanks, Mark. I got a question for you. And Mustafa is asking, in GDPR, which one is more important? Is it cybersecurity, like encryption, access management, or process record management for consent management, retention period management, etc.? Do you think which one is much more important, and what is the percentage of their importance in your view?
Yeah, I think they're both the same, but I think, okay, so if you look at it from the organization's perspective, right, you want to make sure that you have a good story to tell if you get audited because you've had some kind of breach. So I think you need to make sure that your records management process is up to speed, that you have evidence to back up what's happened. I think cybersecurity is equally important, but I think that if you have a gap in your cybersecurity and you have some sort of action plan to take care of that gap and a breach happens during that process, you also have a good story to tell. So I think you're not going to get away with not doing encryption, right, and protecting information or training people. You have to do that stuff. But you need evidence, always evidence to back up everything that happens. You can't get away with that. So I think, ultimately records management is very important.
Okay. Thanks for your answer, Mark. Also, I have a query for you. After COVID, we are seeing that lots of companies says that you can work from your home, actually work from anywhere. After this point, I just saw that today, Spotify says that. Do you think is that a problem if a worker works from a country which is not in the GDPR area, and we are a company from Europe?
Well, like I was talking about the flow down clauses, I think so. There's a couple ways to look at this. So I think most of the work from home can be controlled so that personal information never leaves the base country. I think people can log into your country and they can use your cloud in your area and never actually bring any data down to the desktop. And they shouldn't be bringing data down to their desktop to work on it, because that would be really difficult to manage from a risk perspective. So I don't think there's any problem with people working from home. I think that's great, but I think the security architecture needs to be able to support how the GDPR is implemented, and there needs to be technology put in place to make sure. The one outstanding thing that I've seen that's really evolving right now is with those remote workers is the use of any sort of advanced threat prevention or endpoint prevention to make sure that someone doesn't use the remote device in that person's country, wherever they're working from, use it as a channel to get into the base country. So that could be a concern. So their endpoint protection needs to be strong if you're going to allow remote workers, to make sure that if they're working on private information, that it can't be breached.
Okay, thank you for your answer. And you says that people are responsible for that personal information which are located on that user's desktop will be definitely part of that responsibility within the GDPR, because that data physically leaves that country.
if it physically leaves, yeah, I think you need to look at the architecture, or the company that's doing it needs to look at the architecture, because it should never leave the base country. It doesn't have to be processed. So yeah, that's a big risk, I think, because then you have to make sure, you know, you have like VPN, you have encryption on their device. You have some kind of device management system. So if their device gets lost or stolen, you got to be able to delete their system. There's lots of different types of risks. If a person brings the data down to their desktop and they work on it in their country. So if, for instance, you're in the UK, if somebody's in Denmark, right, accessing your system in the UK, they should never be pulling that data back from the UK into Denmark and working on it there. They should be going into the UK and working on the cloud that's in the UK in that data. Yeah, it's tough.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I think
You're
it's going to
welcome.
be the one of the new challenge for us in this new work order.
Yeah, I think so, because we're talking about, you know, cybersecurity architecture, and investments need to be made in order to make sure that you have the proper security in place, so that you don't have these challenges or exposures potentially, right? So yeah, it's going to be challenging for a lot of people.
Thanks, Mark.
You're welcome. Okay, so continue. All right. The NIST cybersecurity framework. So it was originally released in, I think the presidential order was given in 2014, as I mentioned before, President Obama in the US. And then we got some final drafts. I started teaching it in 2015. And now we have version 1.1, which has changed. It's gone through some little changes, but nothing too big. Early in the drafts, I mentioned that the first drafts, when they were asking for the public to comment, there was a lot of privacy statements in it that vanished after about 6 months of going through the drafts, 8 months, because I think the FBI and the NSA were invited to the meetings and they saw all this personal information being protected, and they're thinking like, oh my God, how am I going to get access to people's data, right? And then it was put back in 1.1, but it was not as stringent, I don't think. Again, I like to break down frameworks when I implement them into matrices, so that I have a good handle. The weighting of the controls, as you can see, where they're located, what are the totals. This is a very light framework. It only has like 108 control points, nothing like PCI has like, 370. NIST 853-4 has like 800 control points. There's lots of more, I guess, structured frameworks out there that are less flexible. And that's one thing I will say about this is it's compliance with GDPR, compliance with NIST is like with PCI, it's very prescriptive. So there's no way, like in the ISO 27000 world, where you have your mandatory controls and your discretionary controls, there's no way here where you can actually risk justify removing any of the controls from this framework. So they all have to be implemented at some point. So really what we're talking about doing is doing a gap analysis, not so much a risk assessment, and then identifying the gaps and developing procedures for each of the 23 procedures that are here. So under identify, you have, asset management, business environment, governance, risk assessment, risk management, supply chain management. So each of those have to have some kind of a procedure on how to handle the respective control points. So for instance, under asset management, there's 6 different types of controls points that need to be implemented to make sure that the procedure is complete and addresses all the basic requirements. So I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. As I mentioned, each of these different sections, identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover, all have a set of procedures basically that need to be implemented. So under identify, you can see that we have 29 different control points. here. You can see under asset management, we have 6 different control points that need to be implemented just for asset management alone. Business environment is really about writing a business plan around your business and how you plan on implementing cybersecurity. The governance, of course, is establishing that governance committee and the governance processes and mechanisms on how you're going to maintain accountability and for decision making, pardon me, in order to make sure that the right people are making the right decisions. For example, when I create a governance committee, I use a terms of reference. Terms of reference explains what type of information will be brought to that committee and what are the decisions that are expected from that committee. We list the executives, usually the people who are responsible for the different portfolios within the organization, as the committee members. They're allowed to send delegates as long as they can make decisions. If they don't, then we make decisions based on a quorum. And the ball just keeps rolling forward when it comes to governance, and there can't be any showstoppers. And that terms of reference is signed by the president of the organization. So there's no questioning around how the governance committee is structured or what it's supposed to do and how it's supposed to function. Risk assessment procedure needs to be documented, needs to be practiced. The risk management strategy is about how do you organize risk management? What's its role within your organization? This would also include defining the risk appetite. So there would be some kind of a risk management policy that establishes the appetite or the threshold. And I've used a very unique way to do that because I don't use qualitative risk assessments anymore. I use quantitative, and I calculate risk ratings. And based on the risk rating, I set a threshold, the risk appetite for the organization. So anything that, for instance, scores 80 or above in a risk rating, we take immediate action on. And anything that falls 79 or below can fall into a type of service level agreement that might be based on 10-day turnaround, 30-day turnaround, or 90-day turnaround. So it's less risky, but certainly anything 80 and above means that we have a breach, or we don't have a breach necessarily, but we have an exposure and there could be a breach. So we need to close that exposure as quickly as possible. And for those items, they usually have like 15 minutes to pick up the ticket and 2 hours to resolve it, or maybe 4 hours, depending on which of the levels. So that needs to be defined. The supply chain risk management aspect is it's something that they added between version 1 and version 1.1. I think they realized how important it is. Supply chain risk has been, well, it was addressed after actually the tragedies around 9/11, and President Bush in the US created a project called Project Vigilance. And it's still going, actually. You don't hear a lot of talk about it, but Project Vigilance was created to identify the risk in the food chain. So if your country, such as Turkey, and you, the millions of people that you have there, purchase stuff at the stores or at the markets or at the bazaar, and we want to know where those ingredients are coming from. I've been to several of the bazaars, the Grand Bazaar and a couple other bazaars, and you see the herbs, the beautiful herbs and everything sitting out there. And but in the U.S., the government wants to know where that's coming from because they're afraid of bioterrorism. And after 9/11, I guess I can't blame them, really. And of course, after the coronavirus, I think we're all aware now of how serious a virus can affect the economy and different countries in so many different ways. So it's probably worse than a world war could ever be when it comes to the pain and suffering that it inflicts on people. Anyway, enough said about that, but that's all tied to the supply chain, and supply chain is a really important thing that you're going to have to work through and you're going to have to define. So you need to find out, in the case of NIST, because it is a government standard, They want to know, what is your role in the 16 critical industries? So there's 16 critical industries. Are you a provider of services? Are you a recipient of materials? Where do you fit into that supply chain? Who's downstream from you? Who's upstream? Who's dependent on you? And then they want you to be able to come up with a plan on how to mitigate any type of risk around that supply chain. And for a short time, I led Morgan Stanley cybersecurity team, 130 people, and very large information risk management process at Morgan Stanley. And I had 14 security architects on my team, and we were constantly reviewing the suppliers or the brokers and the vendors that provided services to Morgan Stanley. And there was a lot of them, there was 4,000. We would review their security architecture, in fact, to make sure that whatever architecture that they were applying in their organization met the Morgan Stanley architecture requirements. And we would constantly be reviewing that. So it's a little bit different than the right to audit. It's a little bit more granular and a little more specific when it comes to checking security and making sure that the supply chain is secure and that it can't be tampered with or used as an avenue into the organization, such as we had with SolarWinds just recently. So enough said about that. So that's identified. There's 29 control points that need to be implemented there, and 6 procedures. And there's 6 procedures here and another 39. So protect. So under identify, we're going to identify the assets, set up governance, do risk assessments, make sure the supply chain is part of that process. Under protect, now we're going to activate what I would consider a very condensed set of control activities, comparable as a very light version of ISO 27001. So we're going to do, look at identity management, authentication, and access control, because that's really important. There's 7 control points around that. Awareness training, making sure that people are aware of their responsibilities and what they're supposed to be doing. We're going to work on data security. Data security is so important. And this part actually probably does have a very close relationship with GDPR, because GDPR wants to make sure that private information is secure. And under the NIST cybersecurity framework, that's the same case. So very important. Information protection processes and procedures. Again, so this, gets into a lot of details around what we're going to document and when it comes to information protection and how we share that with the various people that are responsible. And there's, of course, the maintenance of information and information processes, which is important. And then any type of protective technology that we need to use. So, and under, when we look at the security architecture, cybersecurity architecture, you're going to see a lot of different types of protective technology, for instance. So these 2 first modules really set the stage for the incident handling modules that are going to come. And those are the next 3. So under detect, so we're going to set up some kind of a security information event management system, some type of monitoring and event alerting. This doesn't really get down to the type of threat modeling that we need to do. I worked with IBM for 2 years on the red team, attacking offshore financial institutions from our sister company in the US. And I can tell you that a SIEM is just, it's good to alert you to what to do, but it doesn't really tell you where all the vulnerabilities are, because only approximately about 40% or 50% are known. And on the red team, we never ever went to the common vulnerability and exposure database to try and identify where are the weak points, because that was just easy to do. So what we would do is we would review the infrastructure and the technology used, and we would find gaps in the type of technology that was used that are not even registered in the CVE. And we would use those avenues, because those avenues can't be detected by an intrusion prevention system or a SIEM. And if you're, if you're a true hacker at heart, the thing you want to do is get inside an organization and get back out without even being detected. And maybe your dwell time will be big, you know, like some of these breaches that we've heard about where dwell time has been, you know, 2 years or a year, right? So under the detect module, we're going to set up some mechanisms on how to identify anomalies and how to deal with events. So we're really starting to define a playbook for identifying and then beginning to respond. We want to do security continuous monitoring. So if you're a government entity, you might have unionized employees doing the monitoring during the daytime, and then you might hand it off to a third party, or you might automatically have a third party doing this type of work for you already. It might be outsourced, okay? In which case you need to have a clear definition of what an incident is and how to respond to it. So service level objectives and risks need to be very finely defined if you have a third party doing this type of work. They're going to be doing the monitoring, and then they're going to be doing some kind of response. They may not be doing all of the recovery that we're going to talk about, but they might initiate the process, and they might depend on the infrastructure team in your organization to do the rest. And then detection processes. So once you identify what anomalies events look like and you have monitoring set up, then you need to make sure that you can detect the processes. So you have taps, whether they're soft taps or hard taps. You have some kind of sensors gathering data. Could be in the cloud. A lot of the new sensors are great because no longer do we monitor east and west anymore. Now we can monitor, or pardon me, north or south. But now we can monitor east and west, which is great because a lot of the new malware technology is not going to come in a traditional way, and it's going to cross across the cloud from east to west without being detected in a traditional system. The other aspect of this too reminds me of a project that I did with the City of Toronto, and that was to implement a decryption and an encryption tool in order for the IPS to be able to do deep packet inspection on these devices. This is a really important aspect because, as most of you know, the internet is going dark, and a lot of the new threats and threat agents are now using encryption to mask their malware and their Trojans. Because in the old system, what would happen is the packets, if it couldn't be inspected, and would be passed through into the target. So not to disrupt the business, because you can imagine if you started stopping all the packets coming into your organization, and because you couldn't interrogate them, you would probably bring the business or the organization to a screaming halt, right? So you need to be able to inspect these packets. So the solution, of course, is to decrypt them and then inspect them, and that takes quite a bit of work actually to be able to do that, because it's not easy. But you need to be able to detect it, and that means that you need to be able to decrypt some traffic that comes in. So that's detect, and that's sort of the first step in any kind of a playbook. And then, of course, the response. So once you detect it, what do you do? So there's 18 controls under detect. There's 16 control points under response. So you need to have a response plan. That is basically a playbook. That involves communications, any type of analysis that's required. Could be forensic, could be detonation in a sandbox, could be making sure you have enough the right logs running so that you can track the information, because as we heard earlier from Cefa, is that records management is so important. Being able to collect evidence and being able to track what's going on in your organization, huge. And I can tell you, there's a lot of people who don't have that. And what happens is when they get breached, they really don't truly know if they've completely remediated the risk. So they remediate as much as they know and then hope that nothing else pops up. But sometimes the bad guys have put a Trojan in your system, or maybe some remote command and control technology that you're not aware of. And boom, a few months later, it happens again. So, and that's really bad. And when that happens. So doing the analysis and then doing the mitigation, being able to resolve, identify where the impact was, and being able to repair that or stop it, eliminate it, gather evidence while you're doing that, because there could be some kind of prosecution happening. And then any type of improvements that you can make. Improvements are a nice, a welcome thing to see in a government security standard. And I say that a little bit tongue in cheek, joking a bit, because that whole feedback loop of, really comes from the ITIL world, I think, and from quality management is, once you've gone through an exercise where you've had a breach, is you need to really sit down with your team and do a lessons learned or a post incident review and take the intelligence from that process and build a better process, right? And so I'm glad to see that NIST has actually baked it in. It's only 2 control points, but it's a good, valuable 2 control points. And then finally, recovery. Now this one is really misunderstood by a lot of people who try to implement NIST framework. A lot of people jump right into business continuity and disaster recovery. And, to be frank with you, I worked on some very large clouds, like the Mirantis cloud I did security work on. It's a petabyte cloud, right? It's enormous, right? These clouds that we see are really replacing the need to have disaster recovery, because now we can restart our business from anywhere in the world as long as our teams are trained to pick up the slack. What we really need to test is failover and make sure that the data is being replicated. Those are the things that are improved. All right. So when we talk about recovery planning, and there's one control point there, it's, this is pretty light. So you look at all the different sections within the NIST framework, and you can see based on what I've compiled here in the matrix, you can see that under identify 29 control points, a lot of emphasis there. Under protect, there's a lot of emphasis there. So these really build the program. Now under the incident handling process, you can see there's a lot more emphasis on being able to detect anomalies. Of course, makes sense, right? And then being able to respond just a little bit less. But when you talk about recovery, 6 control points, not very much. Recovery planning, making improvements, and then communicating what those improvements are. So I know based on my IT experience, and I'm sure there's lots of people here on the call who have very deep knowledge on ICT or IMIT or IT. When you have to recover from an incident that's caused a breach within your organization, you just can't do that in one step. There's going to be several steps. And so I think this area, actually the recovery area, is very weak in the NIST framework. But the idea is that the recovery process needs to put the organization back into that steady state mode that it was in prior to the breach. And the improvement section, 2 control points, like the one above, RSIM here, you can see that these are actually they're identical, really. This is about doing continual improvement, which again, I applaud for the government to put in, but it's definitely, it's needed in order to harden systems, harden your processes. The communication part about, okay, so, up here we're communicating under response, oh, we've had a problem. We're telling the stakeholders, and maybe the CEO or the president, that we've had a problem, because he's going to get some calls. So we're prepping them for that. So on one side, there's some media preparation going on as well, if you're a public entity. And then down here, we're communicating that it's all clear, right? That we're back to steady state, and then it's all normal. But only one step in recovery planning. Very weak. That's my opinion. So hopefully you folks have enough experience to know that it's going to take more than just one step to identify what the impact was to your organization and how you're going to go about fixing that and making sure that it doesn't happen again. And it's going to take some work. Okay, so enough about that. So I did create a reference model. I like to create reference models because they simplify the framework, the architecture, to a point where senior management can grasp it quite easily. So we have identify with the various control points, fits into protect like this. So the two of these work together at the highest level of the process of the reference model. And then we have detect, and detect runs, parallel to everything that we're doing. Once we start to protect systems, we want to start monitoring them. So part of the protection process should be making sure that they're logging, making sure that if there's any kind of error messaging that needs to be recorded in the SIEM or in the collectors, that it's gathered and brought in so that we can determine at the Security Operations Center if there's something unusual happening. And then, of course, then there's the response and the recovery process, which is really a big part, the heart of the incident handling practice. That's a reference model I like to use. Pardon me. Now, the actual process looks like this. So risk management, governance, asset management, all of those things, event management, information protection practices, and vulnerability management, they're all built into these first two steps. So first we identify the assets, set up the governance committee, do the risk assessments, evaluate the supply chain, and then we go about protecting that. So right there in those two steps, we've done a lot of work in order to make sure that we're ready to start monitoring so that we can detect. Continual monitoring should be done, 24 hours a day, 365 days of the year. And then if detect identifies any kind of anomaly or something that needs to be investigated, there needs to be some kind of a response. So playbook activation needs to go from the cradle to the grave when it comes to an incident. So they need to be able to pick up the event, be able to triage it, analyze it, determine if there's any kind of serious threat, and then they need to be able to take immediate action if there is, including eradicating it, minimizing the damage, recording any kind of evidence that needs to be captured. So the preservation of evidence is important, of course, if there is going to be some follow-up legal action. And then, of course, part of that process, the system could fail over. We could be in the middle of dealing with a cybersecurity incident, and we have a failover occur to another instance because the primary system has gone down. And then, of course, recovery. So we want to return to steady state, ideally within a couple hours. It might take longer. I hear some companies taking a week because they're so damaged, but that's terrible for business. So you want to have some good service level agreements in place to make sure that everybody's providing service on the process can help and get this resolved as quickly as possible. And then once the recovery is done, then you want to do some kind of feedback. So you want to do a post-incident review for continual improvement to harden the systems. This is a quality management feedback loop that we talked about in a couple of places within the NIST cybersecurity framework. Now the curveball within this cybersecurity framework is the tiers, the 4 adaptive tiers. Now, I know that there's some movement to certify organizations based on the remember the CMM? Probably some of you remember from its origin. I think ISACA might have had something to do with the creation of the original one, but the CMM has been around for a long time, and now it's been picked up by the government, and now they're looking at certifying companies based on a maturity scale. However, in the NIST cybersecurity framework, they don't really care that much about maturity per se. They're more interested in how well have you integrated risk management into your business practices. So remember the 23 processes that are part of NIST. Risk management has to be a part of that process in every way. We want risk-based thinking going on in the NIST cybersecurity framework at all stages. And that is it is a curveball, because a lot of the people that are involved in the NIST cybersecurity framework, whether it's operational or risk management, a lot of them are not that familiar with a risk-based thinking approach. So this is going to take some time to get in place. The risk management process needs to be defined. Can it be partially implemented, informed, repeatable, or adaptable? You have to set the goal. This is like a profile setting. You have to set the tier and the sort of the risk profile that you want to be at, and then decide the integration of risk management program into all aspects can be brand new for some organizations. So you have to start at the very beginning of, what is a risk? What does it look like? How do you calculate it? And then, of course, external participation. So I know in the US, they talk a lot about public and private partnerships. You hear the PPP, they talk about a lot. So this is important. Now we have some people attempting to do some automation on this by using sticks and a number of different techniques to gather any sort of intelligence around threats and then be able to automatically feed it through some kind of distribution network. So I think that's a great idea. I'm not sure if this particular version of sticks is going to be the one that's going to work, or if we should be looking at some other technology, such as electronic data interchange that we've been using for decades, which has already over 850 defined documents. Maybe we should be taking a similar approach, because actually EDI uses a channel that's not even in the internet. So it might be more secure by sharing threat intelligence information. And it is an ISO process as well. So it's widely used. Needless to say, you have to set a profile. So is your risk management process need to be adaptive, or is repeatable enough? You need to identify that before you start implementing the NIST framework, because everything that you implement is going to have some kind of a risk flavor to it. Some integration. Every process that you implement, all 23 processes, need to have some kind of risk management program integration. And does it need to be repeatable? Probably not. Risk informed is going to get you by, but repeatable or adaptive is probably going to be your target. But when it comes to external participation, simply being informed might be enough to get you by. So you need to set your goals, and then you need to work towards this. This needs to be kind of thought of before you go about the process of implementing the framework. It's right at the very beginning of the process. If you pick up the document and read it, you'll see it there. And the reason why it's there is because they want you to implement 23 processes with always thinking about, how is this going to work with risk management? How is it going to integrate with risk management? How are we going to share intelligence about threats? And those 3 steps, when we detect something, when we respond or recover to something, what can we share as an organization? What can't we share? Because obviously there's going to be a lot of questions. I work with many executive teams, and a lot of them in the commercial sector, especially, maybe not so much government, but they don't want to share because they feel like sharing could expose them to some kind of a new risk that's not checked. Because what if they're wrong? What if they provide the wrong information and someone actions it, and then they come back to you and say, well, you gave me the wrong advice, So there needs to be some kind of agreement, I think, between the parties that are sharing the intelligence to say, you know what, this is just, for your information. And if you choose to action it, that's your choice. So, okay, so that's the tiers are interesting aspect. Now, some of the key control points that I see are cybersecurity management systems for sustainability. They need to include the processes that are within a management system. I'm going to talk about again. Governance, risk management, continual improvement, internal audit needs to be a big part of this. Internal audit is not mentioned in GDPR. It's not mentioned in NIST. It is mentioned in ISO 27001, and it's a process, a mandatory process actually. And it should be in all standards, in my opinion, because the internal audit team are the people who keep an eye on the processes to make sure they're working properly. And it's not going to be the people who are actually kicking them off. There needs to be strategic communications to make sure that we're sharing intelligence around the processes that we're carrying out. There needs to be some awareness training to build skills and competencies within the teams. And there needs to be record and document control. As we talked about earlier several times here, you need to keep records to prove that the process is working. You need document control to make sure that if there are procedures and steps that are being continually improved, that you have the right version. Right? The framework looks at 108 different control points. And we talked about the weighting within the different areas. Identify and protect, obviously, are very, very important in order for identify and protect are very, very important to make sure that detect, respond, and recover can do the job that they're designed to do. This is, for all intents purposes, this is an incident handling procedure that's kind of been put on steroids, and they've tried to build in some other features into this. So, but it's mostly about dealing with cybersecurity incidents and resolving them quickly and sharing intelligence. There's 4 tiers that need to be considered. If you're doing an audit of the system, you can definitely look at those 4 tiers to see how well the risk management process has been integrated. Is it repeatable, adaptable? And whether the process is working. And then, of course, you need cybersecurity architecture to help set the stage for where the controls are in place and to provide that defense in depth. And to make it sustainable, as I mentioned before several times, you need a management system. And you need to have governance, risk management. You need to have continual improvement in there. You need to have strategic communications. You also need to have awareness training. You need to have some kind of document control and record management. And you also need to have internal audit, external audit to review the management system to make sure it's working properly. Okay. You can't have a sustainable system if you don't have a management system. That's my opinion. It's a quality management approach. You need to use quality management in your process in order to make sure that it's sustainable. Scope is important of the program, defining, the outer layers. So you have the management system, as I mentioned, and then you have human resources, which is important, hiring the right people with the right competencies. It's one of the requirements. Competencies are required in ISO 27001. Not a lot of talk about it in the other standards, but it's definitely important. So HR plays a big role in that. You need to have physical security. You need to have information technology base to help. There may be different groups that are in scope for your GDPR. You might also exclude some. There could be data centers, and there could be some exclusions that are out of scope. But defining the scope, at least the initial scope, the big picture might be the complete organization or the complete enterprise. But you need to really try and narrow the focus so that you can get those quick wins and gain confidence of senior management. I've seen some projects where that wasn't done, and senior management starts to wane on their support, and that can be a serious tragedy for your project, causing it to be pushed down on the priority list to the point where maybe it's not even functioning anymore. So you want to make sure that you get those quick wins, that you prove that it's viable, you prove that it's sustainable, and that you provide some value, and you need to be able to communicate that value. So that's, again, one of the things in ISO 27001 I'm not talking about today, but I have mentioned it many times, is there's a section on performance management. And what I usually do with the NIST framework is where it talks about the business environment is I'll include some key performance indicators, some critical success factors, and I'll map the strategic goals and objectives of the organization to the activities of the program, of the NIST cybersecurity program in this case, to make sure that we have some really kind of a business plan when it comes to how this operation is going to be run, how this process is going to be run. And those are the types of things that senior management can relate to, and they understand, and that will get you some more support. Also, the governance committee can approve this and review it, so that will also give you more support on your program. Governance committee, speaking of governance committees, so again, I usually ask the president to nominate the top executive in each of the portfolios to participate. They need to understand the regulatory environment, the legal obligations, the statutes, any type of internal facing contracts that we might have obligations to follow, or external obligations. They need to make decisions when it comes to risk. So we do risk assessments, we present risk assessments, we present corrective and preventative action plans, and we record it in a risk treatment plan. And the risk treatment plan becomes the dashboard for the governance committee to see how the risks are being addressed. And of course, the risk assessment process helps them by prioritizing it with the risk rating. So we look at the exposure that the vulnerability might be exploited by a threat against. So we try to quantify that, and we also give them credit, of course, for any of the current investment in security mechanisms. That risk turns into being policies and procedures for employees, and also it should be added into the job descriptions of employees, which is not always the case. Every employee, you probably hear it a million times, you probably say it yourself, is that it's everybody's responsibility when it comes to GDPR compliance, or when it comes to NIST and cybersecurity responsibilities. It's everybody's responsibility. And I highly recommend this. And this is, again, something that comes from the ISO 27000 world, is that once we do risk assessments and we present corrective and preventative action plans, and the governance board agrees to it, and we have captured that in that important record known as the meeting minutes, the controls that have been agreed to get registered into some kind of a authorized control registry. And the reason why we do that is because a lot of times through social engineering, a third party might do an assessment. It might be a pen tester, a security tester. It could be an external auditor. Could come in, find some risks, make some recommendations around controls. And maybe the people who are, coordinating that process may not realize that we already have controls in place that could be optimized to resolve those. And we don't want to duplicate controls, because more layers of control are not good for the organization. You can choke the oxygen right out of the organization's lungs until it dies if you apply too many controls. So there needs to be some kind of a balance with that process. And one of the balance steps might be the authorization of controls by the governance committee and a registry. And then people can check against the registry to see if the control's already been implemented or not. Now, I just call it plainly a registry here, but of course, if you're from the ISO 27000 world, then you know what I'm talking about is a statement of applicability, which is a document that gets submitted with certifications and registrations, and it actually lists the controls that we've risk justified into scope for the organization. And that's a very good practice, in my opinion, something that all organizations should do. It's have better control over your risk. Now, GDPR and cybersecurity are not the only legal obligations that we have that talk about the handling of information. So sadly, this is not very well communicated and not very well known. As part of the ISO process, we create a legal registry. So we have to define those 4 elements I talked about: statutes, regulations, internal facing, external facing contracts. And some of these acts fall into those categories. So you can see we have cybersecurity laws. There's quite a few of them. We have financial laws, which talk about the integrity, confidentiality of information. And we have privacy laws, which also talk heavily about the confidentiality and not so much about availability, but certainly about integrity. So each of these, and this is just a small set. So to give you an example, a legal registry that I've created could have 60, 70, 80 different regulations, laws, statutes, because there's a lot of them. And a lot of them do have information protection requirements for reporting purposes or for records keeping. There's a lot that we need to do that we could provide more value to when it comes to cybersecurity to the organization. All right, now when it comes to, I'm near the end here, so I know I've been talking for a while, and we're gonna hopefully have some time for questions. But I hope that I've been able to come across okay. I apologize for not knowing Turkish and not being able to speak in your native tongue, but I do appreciate the opportunity to speak here, and hopefully some of this information has been of value to you. So when it comes to cybersecurity architecture, we have a 10-layer approach here. Because one of the things that I've learned working on the red team with IBM is that the more layers that you have, the more lucky you are to defend yourself. And it's simply because hackers are lazy, okay? Unless they're state sponsored and they have the Chinese Communist Party or someone pushing them from behind to do it or else. They're only going to hack as far as they can. And then when they finally hit a roadblock that they can't get past, they're going to stop. So the more layers that you have, the more protected you will be. And so I've gone through the various technologies that many of my clients use, and I've created this 10-layer defense to give you some kind of an idea of what that might look like. So on the edge firewall, we have things like physical security. We have closed circuit television. We have physical key locks, and we might have barriers. And of course, we have environmental controls. These are all on the outside of the perimeter. On layer 2, we have some kind of a demilitarized zone usually. We might have some kind of defense against DDoS protection. We might have reverse proxies. We could have other types of technology in that DMZ. The interior firewall might have a network intrusion prevention system. They could be using natting as a defense against different types of threats from the outside, from the wilds of the internet. This is usually where the security zones get defined. We could have network access control to make sure that the wrong devices are not, or unauthorized devices are not plugging into our network. And of course, the VPN server. Now, some people put the VPN server in different locations, but this is the most secure place to put it. So if you put your VPN server in the DMZ, yeah, that's probably not a finding. Layer 4, switching, MPLS, load balancing, DNS, VLAN, all of these provide some kind of security to defend against and filter and control and manage data flows and packets. Layer 5, we have access control, identity and access management. People can't get access to the network unless they have some kind of identity and access management authorization, some entitlements. This is also where we would create group profiles or use role-based access control to try and streamline how objects are created and managed within the organization, because we don't want private ownership of objects, and we don't want people having private entitlements such as to super or root access or to anything like that. So we prefer to manage it through groups. It's easier to take somebody off the group and put them on the group. And that way you can keep track of it. You can audit the group. You can report on the group and determine what's been done by the profiles in that group. Layer 6, we have anti-malware. We might have endpoint protection. We have peripheral security, mobile security. We have the Internet of Things security. We have enterprise intrusion protection systems that monitor the infrastructure for any type of intrusions. Layer 7, we have data loss prevention. This is where our security information event management system sits. And this is where we probably do some intelligence sharing from the SOC, from the SIEM. This is probably where we're gathering, analyzing, synthesizing information and coming up with some type of intelligence that's going to be viable or valuable to our partners and the people who we work with in our industry. And then layer 8, we have the cybersecurity management system, which is I've been talking about over and over again, as management systems are so fundamentally important to managing all the details around a cybersecurity program or even GDPR compliance for that matter. You need to have some kind of a quality management system to make it work. ITIL could be part of that process, defining some of the procedures, practices. You need to have privacy impact assessments done. STRA, security threat risk analysis, is important to do. This is a process that it's free, it's available for download from the RCMP. Royal Canadian Mounted Police have developed this, and it's a very good risk management framework. You can evaluate everything from server risks to terrorism. So it's a very good framework to use for a number of things in an enterprise. Of course, ISO 27001, I talk about many, many times. NIST, cybersecurity framework, and of course, SOC 2 also relies on this very same type of controls that might be specifically for your financial system, but baked into layer 8. And then layer 9, I put as cloud computing, because unlike some people, I do believe that cloud computing actually may have some risks, but it also provides a lot more security. And as I mentioned before, when it comes to business continuity or disaster recovery, those things are going away. The cloud is really taking over in those areas. And cloud computing is providing new layers, new capabilities when it comes to security that can make a business more resilient to any kind of hacking or breakdowns. And then finally, layer 10, if all else fails, then we do have service continuity, succession planning, and we do have business continuity and disaster recovery. So if the cloud fails and everything else fails in front of it, then we have to start all over again. Then we need to make sure that we do have some backup somewhere to restore the data and get the systems back up and running. So these are all the management system is at layer 8, as I mentioned before. And it should include these elements: governance, risk management, program management, strategic communication, knowledge management, security architecture, monitoring, and integration. And defense in depth is all about layers. And as I mentioned before, working on the red team at IBM, the more layers you have, the more secure you are. So audit considerations, the implementation process. So NIST recommends this process here: prioritize, orient, create a profile. We talked about the tiers that require those 3 considerations. So you need to have a risk management process. It needs to be integrated, and you need to be able to share intelligence. So that's the profile that you need to create. And then you need to conduct a risk assessment to see where you are when it comes to infrastructure protection. Create a target profile, which is the star where you're going to be going. So the current profile, so current state, future state, classic, determining, analyzing, prioritizing gaps, and implementing an action plan to resolve those gaps. Under the ISO framework, we have established the scope, create conformity matrix, which I'm going to talk about in a second. I think I have 2 more slides left, so thanks for your patience. Create a list of assets. So we need an asset inventory, because if we don't know all the assets in scope, we don't know we only need one asset in our infrastructure to create a vulnerability, as you've seen many, many times. $750 million in damages because one strut vulnerability wasn't patched, right? So one device. So you need to have all your assets listed. You need to have some kind of vulnerability management process going on, a risk assessment of those assets. You need to create a legal registry, because you need to have a good understanding. Your governance committee should know what your legal obligations are. And 9 out of 10 organizations that I start to work with at the beginning don't have this. So it's something that needs to be created almost for every organization. Conduct risk assessments, risk treatment plans, execute communication strategy, establish internal audit process. Internal audit, there are quality managers that make sure the processes are running and help us to fix the gaps by providing good insights into the organization. Establishing performance metrics and transferring knowledge and operational control. So sharing knowledge about what's going on. So you can see 10 steps versus 7. And I would definitely say that if you're auditing an organization that says that they've implemented NIST cybersecurity framework, I would seriously say you take a look at the ISO process, look at the steps that are in there, and see if you can identify any type of evidence in the NIST framework implementation process, if that's the one that they followed. Because there are really only 2 common areas here. They talk about setting a scope, and they talk about doing risk assessments, and everything else is completely different. And this is really about, this CSF is really about incident management, where ISO 27001 is about information protection, information security. So it's more enterprise caliber framework. The conformity matrix is an ISO 9001 technique. And if you're the manager of a cybersecurity program or a GDPR program, I strongly recommend that you go through this exercise and you list the controls and the clauses in these first three columns. Who's responsible for that, what the current maturity level is of that, and then list where the evidence can be found and location, if it's on a SharePoint or if it's somewhere within your environment. You can have more than one piece of evidence that substantiates the fact that you're doing this process. So for instance, information security policy for supplier relationships is created, and the control objective is information security requirements for the mitigation of risks associated with supplier services or supplier access to organizations' information or information processing facilities shall be documented. Okay, the person who's responsible in this case is the legal counsel. Not sure if that's the right person, but level 4, maturity. So that means that if you know the maturity scale, so initial 1, ad hoc 2, documented 3, number 4 is managed. So that means that there's some kind of a management process. So that means they're doing a review of the process to make sure it's working. They have some kind of metrics in place, right? So some of the pieces of evidence that you would look at to validate that are listed here. You could look at the supplier relationship management practice. That's a document. Practices are different than procedures. Procedures have step-by-step. Practices don't. So that's the big difference. You could look at the legal obligation registry. You could look at the service level management practice. You could look at the information handling practice. You could look at awareness records to make sure people were trained on what to do, know what to do. You could look at meeting minutes where the decisions were made. You could look at the attendance to make sure that everyone was on board. And of course, the final evaluations to make sure knowledge was transferred. So these are the areas you can look at. And if you go to SharePoint, you should be able to find evidence of that. So in the programs that I run, we set up the SharePoint. We put these buckets in here. We call it clause, for instance, A1511. And then we'll put evidence of that actually occurring within the process. So conformity matrix is great because when the external auditor shows up and they want to review your control framework and your infrastructure, you can have all your controls listed, who's responsible for them, the maturity level, and all the locations of the, all the sources of evidence. And then finally, the records that back up that evidence, all consolidated in one place, which makes the external auditor's job much easier. And then they can focus on doing interviews and validating to make sure that the activity is done. So conformity matrix is a good tool to use. Also, quality control checkpoints. If you're familiar with quality management auditing, you can go through a process and you can define what are the points. So we talked about control points, if you remember, in those matrices that I created for GDPR and for NIST. Some of them had 6 control points, some of them had 12, some of them had 1. Okay, so you can define those here in this third column. What is the control checkpoint that you want to be validated for this process? So you can decide on the frequency that you're going to review it from a quality management perspective, quarterly, monthly, whatever, weekly. You can talk about the procedure that's involved in order to make that, to prove that process is working. And then you can define what are the steps in the process where you might find some evidence that, for instance, governance has been working. So you might look at the materials that were prepared for the meetings, the schedule of the meetings. You might look at the attendance at the meetings. You could look at decisions, records. You could look at meeting minutes. You could look at risk treatment plan recommendations that were approved. You could look at the budget that was allocated or the risks that were resolved. And then, of course, every process has some kind of manager assigned. And finally, on quality control checkpoints, you can decide what is the minimum level of quality that I want to see. So if I have 8 checkpoints, how many of those actually have to produce evidence in order for me to be satisfied that this procedure is functioning normally? Do we need to find 100% with zero tolerance? Maybe that's the case. Maybe it's not the case. Maybe it's less. It depends on the process and the criticality of that process to the organization. So that's checkpoint. So those are some tips for you. I hope that you found them useful. I'm done talking for now, and it's your turn.
Thanks for your presentation. Mark, actually, it's so much knowledgeable for most of the people. And also, we are not active users of NIST framework in Turkey. Also, before I was working from Turkey. But in Turkey, we are very much implementers of ISO 27000, and which is basically connected to the NIST. I think that's why this could be so useful. To be honest, and I didn't get any query related to NIST. This may be the reason. Basically, but I know that you have your YouTube channel, and also in the presentation I saw that. Maybe you can mention about your YouTube channel and that content, and people can leverage that information in the future.
Oh, sure. Okay. Yeah, if so I do have, so I created the Bernard, during the pandemic, I created a new business called the Bernard Institute for Cybersecurity. This is a place where I'm basically depositing all the experience that I've gathered over 30 years and creating some lessons and some training. So you can go there, you can check that out. You can go to my YouTube channel. I do put some stuff out there. Also, I'm recording segments of each of the different pieces of work that I've been working on. And you can go to Vimeo and identify or see those. Some of those I also share, of course, through LinkedIn. So you can go from LinkedIn over to Vimeo and find out where Vimeo is. My goal is to try and provide as much as I can. I have a new, I guess, a chief cybersecurity curriculum coming out that I'll be talking about more in the next few months. What else can I say? I'm also on Facebook and of course on Twitter. So if you want to follow me, you can follow me.
Sefa, there is a question from one of our attendees, Mr. Ismail. His question is about for small, medium-sized companies, who should be the author of GDPR compliance and where should they put the DPO in the organization?
Yeah, there has to be, DPO has to be, I mean, so an enterprise starts at 500 employees. So below that, if you go to a mom and pop organization, I think the best thing, if you're like 10 people or 20 people, probably the best thing is to outsource it, to hire like a virtual DPO, somebody who knows what needs to be done and can help guide you. Because to develop, a specialized role just to do DPO is pretty expensive for a small organization when they're just trying to, build their organization, build their business. So it's going to be hard for them. Who would be the best person? Again, you could outsource it. If you wanted to assign it to somebody internal, I think it has to be somebody who has some kind of oversight. I don't think it can be an operational role. It has to be someone with oversight who's going to be able to help guide the operations team on what to do and when to do it. If they're involved in the decision making, if you're auditors, you all know that you can't audit your own work. So making decisions about making a decision and then going back and reviewing that decision is a conflict of interest. I don't know if that helps, but could be your security officer, could do both roles.
Thanks, Mark. And also in the chats, we have a new query for you. Can you able to see that question?
Let me see. Shut this down. See if I can see the chats.
Should be the last message.
Oh, there it is.
Mustafa.
Okay. Last message?
Yeah, in terms of record management.
Okay. Yeah, that's a hot topic, records management. Are there any solutions in terms of records management? Are there any solutions that offer company-wide solution for record management across different vendors in the infrastructure to provide GDPR records tracking? Wow, that's a good question. Yeah, I can't really name one specifically. I know when it comes to records management, it is a big to-do. I think what you could do, what some of my customers do is when we set up the asset inventory, we identify like the 6 assets. So, pardon me, people, information, software, hardware, telecommunications devices, because data is transitory in telecommunications devices. So it's not the same as true hardware that could store or process it. And then facilities. So if you look under the second one, information, technically records are information. So if you had an asset inventory system, you could maintain records through that asset inventory system to keep track of it. There's other ways to do it too, but that's one way.
We have another question for you. It's also on the chat.
Okay. In what detail should data destruction be? For example, an online sales company should delete the purchase history when a customer closes the account or deletes the old expired purchase records, even if the customer relationship continues. Yeah. I think I can't speak about Turkey, but I know that in North America, organizations have a legal obligation to maintain financial records for 10 years. No, would this include, so this is a bit tricky because I know I worked as an enterprise executive manager for Hyperwatt, got bought by PayPal for a while. And because we were PCR compliant, we had to maintain some purchase histories, but at the same time, it was tricky because if you have an individual who owns a company, so they're an entrepreneur, one person, they own a company, it gets really blurry because their financial records, their private financial records, are technically their company's financial records. So in that instance, you can't keep them, right? Because it's personally identifiable information. So that's the tricky part. But I think if it's a bigger organization that has like 5 people or something, that probably you need to maintain it for whatever the the financial industry requires in your country. And I know in North America it's 10 years.
I believe it also should be part of privacy impact assessments for each category of data should be retained for how many years. In my previous project, our lawyers was working on that for each category and what should be the retention period for the data according to Turkish laws. I think that should be so much subjective to each country rather than a generic answer.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's unique to each country. I agree. Yeah.
Thanks for that, Mark. Gökhan, do you have any comment or question?
Thank you, Mark. I have no question. And we now, as I see, we plan to have 1.5 hour event, but as I see, we have now 2 hours, more than 2 hours. We were with Mark. Thank you, Mark.
You're welcome.
It was very pleasure to be with you. It was amazing presentation.
Thank you. Glad to be here. Thank you for the opportunity, Isaka and Istanbul and all the members. It's a pleasure to be here. Love your city. I'm looking forward to coming back in a few months, hopefully, and enjoying the summer as soon as it arrives. I know it's already on the way, but there was this snow thing that happened, right? So I'm sure the Italian wall lizards are probably freaking out. But yeah, I'll be back soon. And if you have any questions, follow-up questions, feel free to reach out to me. And if you want to do this again in the near future, I'm game. So let me know.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you so much, Mark. Also, I am in the same situation like this. I am waiting to visit Istanbul and lifting up that lockdown because also currently Istanbul is under lockdown, like London. I'm just wishing this will end in the summer season. I will go back to see Istanbul again. I hope we can see each other in Istanbul.
Yeah, I think we're praying to God to end this quickly because 1 year lockdown is a lot for a lot of people to deal with.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks everyone. Thanks for your attendance today, and I think we can close this meeting. Thank you so much, Mark. It was very informative for us. Actually, you covered a lot for GDPR and NIST. These are two different huge topics, and you covered a lot. And I think people will get so many beneficial information from your YouTube page and LinkedIn. Guys, please do not hesitate to add Mark on the LinkedIn and on the YouTube. Subscribe that channel, and I will do the same. Also, for anything, you can directly reach out to Mike, or you can reach out to us. We will definitely redirect your message to Mark. And thanks again for this night.
I am ending recording. Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thank
Have
you.
a good day.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.